The plains stretched endlessly, a sea of yellow grass whispering under a cold wind. There was beauty here, yes, but it was a kind of beauty that pressed down on the heart, a silence that demanded endurance. Somewhere between that silence and the horizon lived Elias Brandt, a man who had made peace with solitude, or at least told himself he had. Elias's ranch sat miles from the nearest town, a cluster of weather-grayed boards and a few tired horses fenced in by rough timber. He had built it himself over 10 years, nail by nail, with the kind of patience that only heartbreak can teach. Before the land, before the quiet, there had been a wife and a newborn son. Fever had taken them both one bitter winter, and after burying them beneath the cottonwoods, Elias stopped talking to people, then stopped talking much at all. He worked his land by habit, rising before dawn, feeding his cattle, mending fences, all without hurry and without joy. His only company was the wind and the creak of the barn door. Neighbors sometimes came by offering help, but he always refused politely, his voice a dry rasp from disuse. Some said he'd gone strange, others said he'd gone holy in his grief. Elias didn't much care what people said. The world had already said enough to him when it took everything he loved. At night he would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the stars spill across the sky like sparks from a dying fire. He thought sometimes about leaving, about selling the ranch and heading east where the trains ran and life had rhythm. But something in him was bound to this land, like roots that couldn't pull free. Maybe it was the memory of his wife's laughter carried on these winds, or maybe it was guilt, the stubborn belief that he owed the land his loneliness in return for keeping their graves safe. For years, nothing changed. Seasons turned, cattle were born and sold, storms came and went. Elias's heart had turned to stone, and stones don't move on their own. Then one autumn morning, just as dawn was staining the sky orange, he noticed smoke far off on the northern ridge. At first he thought it was a grass fire, but when it didn't spread, he realized it was something smaller. Maybe a campfire, maybe trouble. The plains didn't forgive foolish travelers. People who lost their way here rarely found it again. Elias saddled his old horse Jasper and rode out. He told himself it was just curiosity, but something deeper urged him forward. The world was wide and cruel, but he still remembered what it felt like to care. That small, dangerous warmth in the chest that he had spent years trying to kill. As he rode, the wind grew sharper, carrying the faint smell of burned wood. The horizon rippled with heat, even though the morning air was cold. When he reached the rise, his stomach tightened. Below him lay the remains of a wagon, overturned, one wheel missing, smoke curling from its shattered side. A single mule still stood hitched to the front, trembling, its eyes wide with panic. There was no sign of life. He dismounted, his boots crunching over broken glass and spilled grain. The wagon had been attacked, the kind of scene he had seen too many times in these lawless parts. Bullet holes peppered the boards, and dark stains marked the dirt. He knelt beside a fallen trunk, touching it gently, feeling the heat still trapped in the wood. It couldn't have happened long ago. Whoever did this was gone now, leaving behind silence and ruin. He was about to turn back and to tell himself there was nothing he could do, when he heard it. A sound so small he almost thought he imagined it. A faint sob like the mewing of a lost kitten. Elias froze. Then he moved toward the sound, pushing aside a tarp near the back of the wagon. There, crouched among spilled flour and broken crockery, was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7. Her dress was torn, her hair matted with dust, and her wide eyes looked at him as if he were another ghost come to finish what the others had started. She didn't cry out. She just stared, trembling, clutching a ragged doll in her hands. For a long moment, Elias couldn't breathe. Something inside him, something he'd buried with his wife and child, cracked open. He crouched slowly, his voice rough as gravel. "Easy now," he said. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The girl didn't move. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. He saw then that her small hands were shaking from cold and shock. He took off his coat and held it out. She flinched when he moved closer, so he set it on the ground instead. "You can take it," he said softly. "It's warm. You need it more'n I do." Minutes passed before she reached for it, hesitantly, as if testing whether kindness could be real again. When she finally wrapped herself in the coat, Elias felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. The look in her eyes was the same one he'd seen in his reflection for years. The look of someone who had lost the whole world and didn't know if it was worth finding again. He asked her name, but she only whispered, "Mama." Then she pointed toward the prairie, toward a small mound near the wreck where the dirt was freshly turned. Elias followed her gaze and understood. She'd already buried her mother herself, or tried to. A small wooden cross leaned in the earth carved with a shaking hand. The rancher stood there a long time, hat in hand, while the wind blew over the plains. Then he went back to the wagon. The girl had fallen asleep sitting up, her head against the wheel, his coat wrapped around her like a cocoon. He stared at her, this small, stubborn spark of life in the middle of so much death, and felt something shift inside him. He could ride away. He could leave her for the next wagon train, tell himself it wasn't his responsibility. That's what the old Elias would have done, the one who'd forgotten how to feel. But as he watched her breathe slow and even, he realized he didn't want to be that man anymore. When the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, Elias lifted her gently into his arms. She stirred, her fingers clutching his shirt. He whispered almost to himself, "I'll be your father now." The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign but right. In that moment, something fragile and powerful was born between them, a bond not of blood but of choice. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, the girl's past, the dangers on the frontier, or whether he could protect her. But he knew one thing. The silence that had filled his heart for so long had finally broken. As he rode back toward his ranch with the child asleep against his chest, the wind changed. It no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like a song, rough, uncertain, but alive. The plains had not given him back what he'd lost, but they had given him a reason to keep living. And for the first time in years, Elias Brandt looked at the horizon and saw not emptiness, but the faint outline of hope. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Elias Brandt reached his ranch, the small girl still asleep in his arms. The ride home had been long and quiet, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the slow rhythm of Jasper's hooves against the frozen ground. The girl hadn't stirred, though once, as the horse crossed a shallow stream. She'd murmured something, a word that sounded like "Mama," caught and lost in the wind. When Elias dismounted, he carried her inside his cabin, a modest place, all rough timber and silence. He laid her on his cot and pulled a quilt over her small frame. The moment he let go, he felt an ache twist inside him, a strange and unwelcome warmth he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something in her fragile presence reminded him of all that he'd lost and all that might still be worth protecting. He stood by the door for a long time, watching her sleep. Dust clung to her hair, her face pale beneath the dirt. She was too thin, her hands small and raw from cold. Whoever she was, she hadn't eaten in days. The wagon, the smoke, the shallow grave, and they told him enough. She'd seen more death than any child ever should. Elias turned away, his throat tight. He busied himself by lighting the fire, heating water, and setting a kettle on the stove. His hands moved with the steadiness of habit, but his mind kept circling back to the same thought. What now? He was no father. He had no experience raising a child, no one to help. The nearest town, Laramie Crossing, was a day's ride away, and he doubted anyone there would take in another mouth to feed. Out here, folks barely managed to keep their own children alive. When the smell of coffee filled the room, he heard a rustle behind him. The girl had woken. She sat up slowly, eyes wide and wary, the quilt clutched around her shoulders like a shield. Elias turned, holding out a tin cup filled with water. "Here," he said softly. "Drink," she hesitated, glancing between him and the cup. Her lips were cracked, her eyes hollow. Finally, she reached out, so gently it broke his heart, and took it. She sipped, then drank greedily, spilling some down her chin. Elias fetched a piece of bread from the cupboard and handed it to her. She stared at it for a moment before eating. Small bites at first, then faster. He waited until she slowed before asking, "What's your name, little one?" She didn't answer. Her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. He tried again, quieter this time. "It's all right. You're safe here." Still, she said nothing. Her silence wasn't stubborn. It was the silence of someone who had seen something too terrible for words. Elias sighed. He'd known that kind of silence once, after his wife and son had gone. The world could break a person in ways no sound could ever describe. "All right then," he murmured. "We'll wait." He let her finish eating, then moved about the cabin, keeping his voice low and calm. He talked not because he expected her to answer, but because he didn't want her to feel alone. He told her about the ranch, about the horses, about old Jasper who liked to steal oats when he thought no one was looking. He even found himself smiling once, though it felt foreign on his face. By afternoon, she'd ventured a few steps from the cot, curiosity overcoming fear. She followed him outside, where the sun poured over the prairie like melted gold. The wind tugged at her hair as she stared at the vast emptiness around them. Elias knelt beside her. "Not much to see, I know," he said. "But it's home." The girl looked up at him. Her lips moved, forming a single quiet word. Home. Elias froze. It was the first thing she'd said, and it struck him harder than he expected. He swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "Yeah," he said softly. "Home." That night he built a small bed for her in the corner, using spare wood and a horse blanket. When he tucked her in, she clung to his sleeve for a moment, a quick, desperate gesture before letting go. It was enough to undo him. He sat by the fire long after she fell asleep, staring into the flames and thinking about promises. He hadn't planned to keep her. He'd thought to take her to town once she was strong enough, to find someone who could care for her properly. But as he watched her tiny chest rise and fall with each breath, that idea felt less and less possible. The thought of her out there again, alone, frightened, another mouth for strangers to pity or turn away, made his stomach twist. He was a hard man, yes, but not heartless. Somewhere beneath the layers of grief, a flicker of tenderness still lived, and that night, while the wind howled outside and the embers glowed low, Elias made a silent vow. He would protect her. Whatever it took. The next morning brought snow. A thin white crust covered the ground, glittering under the pale sun. Elias found the girl sitting by the window, watching flakes drift through the glass. He poured her a bowl of porridge and set it in front of her. "Need a name for you," he said with a hint of a smile. "Can't keep calling you little one, can I?" She looked up, her expression thoughtful. Then, almost whispering, she said, "Clara." Elias nodded slowly. "Clara, that's a good name." He didn't ask if it was truly hers. He didn't need to know. Sometimes names were all that survived when the world burned. Over the next few days, Clara began to speak more. Simple things at first. Water, horse, and thank you. She followed Elias around the ranch, curious about everything. She'd laugh quietly when Jasper tried to nudge her pockets for apples, and once Elias caught her humming to herself while helping him carry wood. The sound, that small, trembling hum, filled the cabin in a way no fire ever could. Each day she grew stronger, and each day Elias found himself talking more, about how to mend fences, how to tell when a storm was coming, how to care for a horse. He told her about the stars, too, how they were like tiny lanterns guiding travelers home. She'd listen, eyes wide as if each word was a treasure. In her company, the ranch no longer felt empty. Her laughter, her small voice asking questions, her tiny footsteps on the porch, they brought life back to the stillness that had haunted him for years. He began to rise with purpose again, not just to work but to teach, to care, to make her world a little safer. But sometimes, when the light faded and the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, Clara would wake screaming. She'd call for her mother in that trembling, broken voice, and Elias would sit beside her, holding her until the sobs quieted. He never told her not to cry. He knew too well that grief, when buried, only grows heavier. One night after such a storm of tears, she looked up at him through swollen eyes and asked, "Are you really my father?" Elias's chest ached. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and said softly, "I reckon I am now if you'll have me." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, slow and sure. She reached for his hand, small fingers curling around his rough ones, and whispered, "Then I'm home." Elias felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. He'd thought the land had taken everything from him, but maybe it had just been waiting for him to find what he'd lost in another form. In Clara's eyes, he saw not the ghost of his past, but the fragile, luminous promise of tomorrow. Outside, the storm eased, the snow settling quietly over the earth. The plains were still vast and cold, but for the first time in a decade, the cabin at the heart of them glowed with warmth, not from fire, but from love returning, hesitant yet steadfast, like dawn creeping over the horizon. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life at the Brant Ranch began to change. The land, once haunted by silence, now echoed faintly with laughter. the soft patter of small boots and the low murmur of a man learning to live again. Elias had never thought himself capable of starting over, yet each sunrise seemed to prove him wrong. Clara had brought something precious into his life: purpose. She didn't know it, but each question she asked, each smile she offered, mended a little more of the brokenness inside him. She followed him everywhere now, out to the barn at dawn, to the creek where he drew water, to the pasture where the cattle grazed under the open sky. She was still thin, still shy at times, but she had color in her cheeks again, and when she laughed, it startled Elias every time, a bright, sudden sound that scattered the ghosts of the past. Winter had settled hard over the plains. Snow stretched in white sheets as far as the eye could see, glittering like glass under the pale sun. Life on the frontier demanded endurance, and Elias taught Clara everything he could: how to stack wood, how to feed the horses, how to tell when snow would turn to storm. She was a quick learner, eager and determined, though she often stumbled under the weight of chores too heavy for her small hands. "You'll break your back before you break that log," Elias would tease gently. Taking the axe from her and showing her how to swing, she'd cross her arms, pretending to pout. "You're too strong," he chuckled in an unfamiliar, rusty sound that felt good. "No such thing as too strong out here. You just keep at it. That's how you get stronger." Bit by bit, she began to open up to him, not in grand confessions, but in small, tender pieces. She spoke of the wagon, of a journey she'd taken with her mother to find her uncle in the Dakotas. They'd been traveling with a small group when raiders attacked, taking the others and leaving her mother wounded. Clara had hidden under the wagon and watched it all, too terrified to move. Her mother had told her to stay still, to keep quiet no matter what. When dawn came, her mother was gone. Clara had buried her alone with her small hands, whispering the Lord's Prayer she barely remembered. Elias listened to it all one night as the fire crackled, his jaw tight, his heart aching. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, she looked up at him with wide, searching eyes. "Did I do bad?" she asked softly. He swallowed hard. "No, Clara, you did brave." The words seemed to settle something in her. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. The firelight flickered across her face, and Elias felt the fierce stir of protectiveness, the kind that could make a man move mountains if he had to. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the snow in shades of crimson and gold, Elias took Clara out to the corral. He was fixing a broken fence post, but mostly he wanted to talk to her, to tell her something he'd been carrying in silence for weeks. "Clara," he said, setting down his hammer, "I've been thinking about the future." She tilted her head, curious. "Are we going somewhere?" He smiled faintly. "Not if I can help it, but I reckon the world might come looking for us one day. When it does, I need you to know this ranch, this home, it's yours as much as it's mine. You understand?" She frowned a little. "But you found me." "Maybe so, but finding you don't make you any less mine now." The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the faint cry of a hawk. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. "What is it?" she asked, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a simple wooden locket, hand-carved, shaped like a heart. It wasn't perfect, a little uneven at the edges, but it gleamed softly in the dying light. Inside the locket, he had placed a tiny drawing, not much more than a sketch, of a man, a woman, and a small child holding hands beneath a big sun. "It's us," she whispered. Elias nodded, eyes distant. "Your mother should have been here to give you something like that. I can't replace her, Clara, but I can promise you this. You'll never be alone again. Not while I got breath in me." Her small hand slipped into his, cold and trembling. "You promise?" He met her gaze, steady as the plains themselves. "On my life." Tears welled in her eyes. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his coat. He held her close, his rough hands gentle against her back. In that embrace, something old and wounded inside him finally healed. For years, Elias Brandt had lived for no one. That evening, beneath the bleeding sunset, he began living for her. The next few weeks tested that promise. The weather worsened, bringing storms that howled across the plains like wolves. Supplies ran low, and Elias found himself rationing food. Clara tried to hide her hunger, but he could see the way her eyes lingered on the empty flour sack. He began trapping small game again, something he hadn't done since before the fever took his family. He taught her how to set snares, how to skin a rabbit, how to cook with patience. Each lesson became more than survival. It was trust passed from hand to hand. The bond between them deepened not through words, but through shared hardship, through the quiet understanding that family wasn't always born of blood. At night, when the wind roared like a living thing and snow hammered against the shutters, Clara would creep from her bed and curl up near his chair. He'd lift a blanket, wordlessly making room. Sometimes she'd fall asleep against his leg, clutching the locket. He'd look down at her and feel something powerful, something both joyful and terrifying. Because love, once lost, always comes back heavier. Then came a day when the storm finally broke, leaving the plains shining under the sun. Elias saddled Jasper and told Clara they were riding into town. She'd never been, and the excitement lit her face like dawn. When they reached Laramie Crossing, people stared. It wasn't common to see Elias Brandt with company, much less a child. He ignored the whispers, walking straight to the general store. He bought her a red wool scarf and a new pair of boots. The shopkeeper, a kind older woman, smiled at Clara. "Pretty thing you've got there, Mr. Brandt. Yours?" Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Aye," he said. "Mine." The words came easy and they felt right. On the ride home, Clara held his hand and asked, "Do you think my mama's watching?" He looked toward the horizon where the last of the snow clouds faded into gold. "I think she is," he said softly. "And I think she's proud." She smiled, that rare, radiant smile that had become the light of his world, and leaned her head against his shoulder. That night, as they sat on the porch, Elias felt peace for the first time in years. The air was sharp and clear, the stars bright above them. Clara sat beside him, her scarf wrapped tight, her little locket resting against her chest. "Pa," she said suddenly. He turned to her. The word caught him off guard, Pa. It hit him like the echo of a prayer he hadn't dared speak. "Yeah, Clara?" She smiled. "I love you." Elias's throat tightened. He looked away, blinking hard at the horizon. "Reckon I love you too, little one." The wind moved gently across the plains, carrying their words away like seeds. The sun had long since died, but its last light lingered, soft, forgiving, full of promise. Elias Brandt had once believed the world had no mercy left in it, but now, with a child beside him and a future he hadn't dared imagine, he understood mercy wasn't found, it was made, one promise at a time. And so, beneath the dying sun, a lonely rancher's vow became the beating heart of two new lives bound together, not by fate but by choice. The snow had melted, leaving the plains damp and green again. Calves bawled in the distance and the wind carried the scent of wild sage. Spring had come to the Brandt Ranch, and with it came a sense of fragile peace. For months, Elias and Clara had lived in rhythm, the slow, honest rhythm of work, laughter, and quiet companionship. But peace on the frontier was always temporary. It was a delicate thing, easily broken by the ghosts of the past. It started with a rider on the horizon. Elias spotted him one afternoon while mending a gate near the creek. The figure was small in the distance, moving slowly, but something in the man's posture made his stomach tighten. Travelers rarely came this way without purpose. The land around the ranch was too wild, too far from the trade routes to attract visitors. He said nothing to Clara, though he caught her watching the same horizon, curiosity bright in her eyes. "Stranger," he muttered mostly to himself. By evening, the rider was gone, vanished back into the vast emptiness. But Elias didn't sleep well that night. He kept his rifle near the bed, listening to the wind against the shutters, waiting for a sound that never came. A week later, he rode into town for supplies. Clara stayed behind with the neighbor's wife, a kind widow named Mrs. Avery who sometimes helped watch her when Elias had to make the long trip. In town, he loaded up flour, salt, and feed, trading the last of his winter pelts for bullets and coffee. As he was strapping the goods to Jasper's saddle, two men at the hitching post nearby were talking in low voices. "Heard there was a wagon hit not far from here," one of them said. "Family headed north, woman and child missing." "Yeah," said the other. "Some say raiders took 'em. Some say only the girl made it." Elias froze, the rope in his hands going slack. "They say her name was Clara Hensley," the man continued. "Uncle's been looking for her since last summer, offering a bounty for anyone who brings her in." A slow dread spread through Elias's chest. Clara's last name? She'd never spoken it, but the story fit too perfectly to ignore. Her mother, the wagon, the raid. Someone out there was looking for her. But bounty or no bounty, Elias didn't trust the kind of men who hunted for money. If they found her, they wouldn't see a child, they'd see a reward. He finished loading his supplies without a word, though his mind was already made up. He'd take Clara away from here if he had to. Move north, maybe into the foothills where the land was rough but safe. She was his now, not by law, but by the promise he'd made. When he returned home, Clara was waiting on the porch, her red scarf fluttering in the wind. "You were gone too long," she said, pretending to scold him, though her smile gave her away. Elias smiled back, trying to hide his unease. Town was busy, folks talking too much as usual. She tilted her head. "About what?" He hesitated. "Nothing for you to worry about, little one." But Clara was no fool. She had learned to read his silences like weather. Later that evening, while they sat by the fire, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "You're scared," she said softly. He froze. She reached for his hand, small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones. "You're scared someone's coming for me." He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "You're a smart girl, Clara. Too smart sometimes. Am I right?" He sighed. "Maybe, maybe not. What matters is I won't let anyone take you. You hear?" She nodded slowly. "Even if they say they're family?" He felt something twist inside him. Even then, she looked away, silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't remember any uncle." "Then you got no reason to go with one," Elias said firmly. "But the past has a way of finding what it wants." A few days later, another rider appeared, this one closer, bold enough to come up the path to the house. Elias saw him before Clara did and stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. The man reined in his horse, raising one hand in greeting. "Easy there, friend," he said. "Ain't looking for trouble." Elias didn't lower the rifle. "Then state your business." "Name's Tom Hensley," the stranger said. "I'm looking for my niece." Little girl, brown hair about this tall. He held his hand at chest height. "Name's Clara." Elias's jaw tightened. "You're too late," he said flatly. "Ain't no child here by that name." Tom studied him for a long moment, eyes sharp and cold. He was well dressed for a man out here. Coat of fine leather, boots polished, a revolver strapped tight to his hip. Not the kind of man who came alone unless he had more waiting behind him. "Funny thing," Tom said slowly. "Folks in town said you've been seen with a little girl lately. Red scarf. Looks an awful lot like my brother's child." Elias didn't move. "You calling me a liar, mister?" Tom smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Just asking questions, for family's sake." "She's not yours to claim," Elias said, voice low. "She's blood," Tom snapped. "And blood, don't forget." The two men stood locked in silence, the wind sighing between them. Then Tom's tone softened, almost convincing. "Look, I don't want no fight. Just let me see her. If she's happy here, maybe we can talk," but Elias knew better. The man's eyes weren't the eyes of family. They were the eyes of greed. He'd seen that look before in men who took what wasn't theirs. "Best you turn around," Elias said, cocking the rifle. Before the sun sets, Tom's smile faded. He held Elias's gaze for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "You're making a mistake, old man." "Been making 'em my whole life," Elias said. "One more won't kill me." Tom spurred his horse and rode off, leaving dust swirling in his wake. But Elias knew it wasn't over. That night he packed provisions, jerky, beans, ammunition. He saddled Jasper and the mare for Clara, though he didn't wake her yet. He knew what was coming. Men like Tom didn't ride alone for long. At dawn, when Clara woke to find him at the table cleaning his rifle, she didn't ask questions. She just stood there watching him. "Are we leaving?" she asked. Elias nodded. "For a while, yes. Someplace quiet. Just us." She clutched her locket. "Because of him?" He hesitated, then said, "Because promises mean you do what it takes to keep 'em." Clara's lip trembled, but she didn't cry. She'd learned courage from him, the quiet kind that doesn't shout or run but stands its ground. Before they left, Elias walked her to the small hill behind the barn where his wife and son were buried. He knelt beside the graves, brushing away the grass. "Mary," he murmured, his voice rough, "you always said I couldn't fix what was broken. Guess you were right. But I found something worth trying for again. A child who needs me as much as I need her. If you can hear me, watch over her." Watch over us. Clara knelt beside him, laying a small wildflower on the mound. Goodbye, she whispered. They rode out just as the sun broke over the horizon, the light spilling across the plains in ribbons of gold. Elias didn't look back. Behind them lay the ghosts of the past. Ahead, the uncertain promise of freedom. He didn't know where they would go, only that they would go together. Because love once chosen is a duty, and Elias Brandt had never broken a promise yet. The morning they rode toward town was bright and sharp, the kind of morning where the air carried both promise and pain. Elias hadn't slept much. He'd sat on the porch through most of the night, his thoughts heavy, his heart heavier. The girl sleeping in the loft above him had brought light into his life, but now that same light threatened to fade. Lily rode beside him, her small hands clutching the reins, her hair catching the sunlight like golden thread. She didn't know the full truth yet, only that they were going to meet some folks. Elias didn't have the courage to tell her that those folks might be her real family. He wanted to freeze this ride in time, the sound of her laughter, the creak of the saddle, the smell of morning grass, and hold it forever. The journey to town took most of the day. They stopped by a stream to rest the horses. Lily splashed her hands in the cold water, humming to herself, a tune Elias didn't recognize, though it made something ache deep in his chest. When she looked up and caught him watching her, she grinned. "You're quiet again," she teased. "You used to be quiet all the time. Now you talk too much," he chuckled softly. "Guess you brought it out of me." "Then don't stop," she said. "I like your talking voice." He wanted to tell her everything then, about the wagon, about finding her beside the wreck, about the promise he'd made. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he said, "No matter what happens, Lily, you remember this, you're brave and you're loved, always." She nodded, not understanding the weight of those words yet, but feeling their warmth all the same. By the time they reached town, the sun was sinking low. The little settlement of Ash Hollow buzzed with life, wagons creaking, horses stamping, the air thick with dust and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. People called out greetings, tipping their hats to Elias and smiling at the sight of the girl. They'd heard stories, of course, the lonely rancher who'd found a child on the plains. Some said it was God's mercy, others said it was fate. At the sheriff's office, Elias dismounted and tied the horses. His hands trembled as he lifted Lily down. The sheriff, a broad man with a weathered face, stepped outside to meet them. "Mornin', Elias," he said softly. "You sure about this?" Elias nodded once. "If she's got kin, they deserve to know." The sheriff glanced toward Lily and smiled kindly. "You're a good man." Inside, a woman stood waiting. Young, perhaps 25, with the same eyes as Lily, the same shape of face. When she saw the girl, she gasped and covered her mouth. "Lily?" The child froze. Something in her eyes flickered. Recognition, confusion, fear. Elias knelt beside her. "It's all right," he whispered. "Go on, sweetheart." Lily took a step forward, then another. The woman fell to her knees and gathered her in her arms, sobbing into her hair. "You're alive," she whispered. "Oh, thank God you're alive." Elias turned away. He couldn't watch. His chest felt like it was being crushed. This was right. It was what any decent man would do. And yet it tore something loose inside him, something that had only just begun to heal. The sheriff placed a hand on his shoulder. "Her name's Clara Wren, sister to Lily's mother. Been looking for the girl since the wagon attack." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. "Then she's home now." He made to leave, but a small voice stopped him. "Papa?" He turned. Lily stood there, her hand in Clara's, her eyes wide and glistening. "Where are you going?" Elias tried to smile. "You've got your family now, little one. Folks who can take care of you better than I can." She shook her head fiercely. "But you said you'd never leave me." Those words cut deeper than any blade. He knelt again, his hands trembling as he brushed the hair from her face. "And I meant it," he said softly. "Even if I ain't right beside you, I'll always be with you." "Right here." He touched her heart. "That's what fathers do." Tears welled in her eyes. "But you are my father." For a moment the world went silent. Even Clara bowed her head, weeping quietly. Elias's throat ached with emotion. "You've made me the proudest man on this earth, Lily," he whispered. "And no matter where you go, you'll always be my girl." He stood, his hat trembling in his hands, and walked toward the door. The sunlight outside was harsh and golden, washing the world in light. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because if he did, he'd never be able to leave. He rode out of town slowly, his horse kicking up dust along the empty road. The plain stretched before him wide and waiting. Somewhere behind him, laughter echoed faintly. Lily's laughter, the sound of a future he had given back to her. Weeks passed. Elias returned to his ranch alone again, but not the same. The silence that once haunted him now felt peaceful. He still set an extra plate at the table out of habit, still caught himself turning to speak to someone who wasn't there. But there was no bitterness left in it, only gratitude. One spring morning, a letter arrived and carried by a rider from Ash Hollow. Inside was a child's drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a big yellow sun. Beneath it, scrawled in clumsy letters, were the words, "Me and Papa, always." Elias stared at it for a long time. Then he pinned it above the hearth where the light would catch it every evening. Outside, the wind carried the scent of new grass, the sound of the river thawing, the hum of life returning. He stepped onto the porch, the same porch where years ago he'd watched the stars in silence. Now he smiled. The land was still lonely, but his heart was not. Somewhere out there, a little girl laughed under the same sky, and that was enough. Elias tipped his hat toward the horizon and whispered, "Ride safe, my girl," and with that, he turned toward the fields, the sun at his back, and went on living, not as the man who'd lost everything, but as the man who had once found a child beside a broken wagon and promised her the one thing she'd never had, a father's love that would never fade.